All right, so get this. We're diving into a world where Columbus never set foot in the Americas.
Really?
No Columbus.
Wow.
Can you imagine? I mean,
Mary.
everyone thinks they know the Columbus story, but
Yeah.
what if history took a hard left turn?
Hmm.
Our sources today explore how that one change could have totally reshaped everything, politics, culture,
Everything, yeah.
the whole shebang.
What's so captivating about this
Yeah.
is it makes you question all those assumptions we have about history.
Right.
Like, we're so used to thinking of Columbus as the guy who discovered America.
Yeah.
But what if someone else got there first?
Yeah, it's like, who are the runner-ups in the Discovering America contest?
Exactly. And your sources point to John Cabot, sailing for England, and Amerigo Vespucci, backed by the powerful Italian Medici family.
Okay, so let's say Cabot wins the race. Does this mean we're all sipping tea and eating crumpets in North America right now instead of tacos and burritos?
Well, not necessarily. But it does make you think, right? With Cabot planting the English flag first, North America could have ended up with a totally different colonial vibe. Maybe even a faster track to independence.
But hold on, wouldn't England have had its own struggles trying to control a chunk of land that massive all the way across the ocean? I mean, even with Spain, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it?
You're absolutely right. There would have been unique challenges for any European power trying to establish a foothold in the Americas. But the point is that the starting point, the initial cultural imprint, would have been drastically different.
Okay, so England might have had its work cut out for them.
Yeah.
But what about Vespucci? What kind of world are we looking at if he'd been the one to discover America?
Now that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Imagine an Atlantic trade network dominated by the Medici family.
Wow.
We could be talking about a very different kind of economic and cultural exchange, maybe even with Italian Renaissance art and ideas influencing the Americas from the get-go.
Whoa, that's wild. Instead of cowboys in the Wild West, we could have had, like, gondoliers in the Wild East. But seriously, though, European exploration was already in full swing.
Yeah.
Isn't it safe to say that someone would stumbled upon the Americas eventually, even without Columbus?
Absolutely. The Americas weren't exactly hiding, but the question is, whose values, whose ambitions, whose vision of the world would have ultimately shaped the continents? And that brings us to one of the biggest what-ifs in this whole scenario.
Okay.
What happens to Spain without their American treasure trove?
Yeah, they were raking in the gold and silver, weren't they? Talk about a cash cow. So what happens to the mighty Spanish Empire without all that loot? Do they just fade into the background of history?
Well, they certainly wouldn't have been able to maintain their military dominance or throw their weight around in European politics the way they did. Without that constant influx of wealth, Spain's trajectory would have been dramatically different.
So who would have stepped into that power vacuum? England? France? Someone else entirely?
It's impossible to say for sure, but the ripple effects would have been massive. Imagine the Napoleonic Wars, for example, with a much weaker Spain backing France. The entire balance of power in Europe could have shifted. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've talked about the potential new discoverers and a weakened Spain, but what about the Americas themselves?
Right.
How would life on these continents have played out differently without Spanish colonization?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Were the English and Portuguese any better than the Spanish when it came to treating the indigenous populations?
Well, the sources highlight some pretty stark contrasts between the ways different European powers approached colonization. Let's take England and Portugal as examples, since they were both major players in the Age of Exploration.
Okay, so if it's the English calling the shots instead of the Spanish, what are we looking at? Would North America be a totally different place today?
Well, England generally had a more decentralized approach to governing their colonies. They often granted more local autonomy, which could have potentially led to earlier independence movements and a faster track to something resembling democracy.
Interesting. So maybe the American Revolution would have happened sooner. But what about Portugal? They were all about trade, right?
Right.
What kind of impact would they have had?
That's right. Portugal's focus was primarily on trade, especially commodities like sugar and spices. So if they had dominated the Americas, we might have seen less emphasis on territorial conquest and more on establishing trading posts and exploiting resources. They might have been less interested in converting the indigenous populations to Christianity and more focused on establishing profitable trade relationships.
But isn't that just another form of exploitation? It seems like the indigenous people were in a no-win situation no matter who showed up first.
You're right to point that out. Unfortunately, no matter which European power took the lead, The indigenous populations of the Americas would have faced immense challenges. Disease displacement and exploitation were tragically common features of European colonialism.
And what about the transatlantic slave trade? Would that have still happened even without Spain involved?
It's a heartbreaking reality, but yes, it's highly likely. The demand for labor in the Americas was enormous, and the tragic system of slavery was already well established in other parts of the world. The scale and timing might have been different depending on which nation controlled the trade routes and plantations, but the underlying forces driving the slave trade were deeply entrenched.
So different colonizers, different approaches, but potentially similar outcomes in terms of the exploitation of indigenous populations and the perpetuation of the slave trade.
Unfortunately, yeah.
It's a lot to process, to be honest.
It is. But it's crucial to remember that even amidst the darkness, there were always glimmers of hope, acts of resistance, and individuals who fought for justice and equality. The story of the Americas is complex and multifaceted, full of both tragedy and triumph.
You've given us a lot to think about already, and we've only just scratched the surface. I'm really curious to see where this deep dive takes us next. Stay tuned, folks, because we're about to explore how this alternate timeline could have totally reshaped the cultural landscape of the Americas.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if the Americas had been infused with different languages, different religions, different ways of life right from the start?
Okay, so instead of salsa music and flamenco dancing, we might be listening to fado and watching... what kind of dancing do they do in Portugal?
Well, they have a variety of folk dances, but that's not really the point. The key takeaway here is that cultural exchange is a two-way street. It's not just about the colonizers imposing their culture on the colonized. It's about the fusion of ideas, traditions, and practices that create something entirely new.
So are you saying that even the food we eat today could be drastically different?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, tacos and burritos are pretty much a staple in my house. What would I be eating if, say, the English had been in charge?
Well, let's consider the potato, for example.
Okay.
It originated in South America, but it was the Spanish who brought it back to Europe.
Yeah.
Imagine if that introduction had been delayed by a few decades, or even centuries.
Okay.
The Irish potato famine, a defining moment in European history, might never have happened. That alone could have altered migration patterns, reshaped political landscapes, and even changed the course of industrialization.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. No potatoes mean no French fries?
Right.
No shepherd's pie?
Exactly.
My world is crumbling. But seriously, it's incredible to think about how one little spud could have such a massive impact.
Yeah.
What else might we be missing out on?
Well, it's not just about the absence of certain foods, it's about the presence of others.
Oh.
Think about the impact of corn on European diets. It became a staple crop fueling population growth and shaping culinary traditions. If another European power had been in charge, they might have prioritized different crops, leading to a completely different culinary landscape.
Okay, so we've got different languages, different foods, even different historical turning points. What about the stories we tell ourselves about the past? Who become the heroes and villains in this alternate timeline? Does Columbus just fade into obscurity?
That's a fascinating point. In our world, Columbus is a controversial figure, but he's undeniably a household name. But in a world where Cabot or Vespucci took center stage, our entire understanding of the age of exploration would be different. Imagine history textbooks with Cabot or Vespucci hailed as the great discoverers.
So instead of Columbus Day, we'd be celebrating Cabot Day, Vespucci Day. I'm not sure those have quite the same ring to them.
Maybe not, but the point is that our collective memory, the events we commemorate, the figures we hold up as heroes or villains, would be fundamentally altered. We might be celebrating entirely different explorers, telling different stories about the founding of nations, even singing different national anthems.
Whoa, I hadn't even considered that. Our national myths, our sense of identity, even our art and literature could all be telling a completely different story. It's like someone hit the reset button on our cultural hard drive.
Precisely. And that's what makes this kind of historical speculation so compelling. It forces us to step outside of our familiar narratives and consider the countless possibilities that could have shaped the world we know today. Imagine the works of art that might have been created if the Americas had been seen through a different cultural lens. The music, the literature, the entire artistic landscape would be transformed.
So instead of cowboys and Indians in classic Western movies, we might be watching, I don't know, Portuguese traders bartering for spices in the Amazon rainforest.
Right.
It's hard to even wrap my head around it.
It's a mind-bending exercise, for sure. But it highlights the power of perspective.
Yeah.
How we view the past shapes how we understand the present and imagine the future. Even the way we perceive the Americas, that sense of the new world, could have been drastically different depending on who was telling the story.
So if the English had been the primary storytellers, would they have painted a different picture of the Americas? Would it still be seen as this land of opportunity and mystery?
It's hard to say for sure, but their accounts might have focused more on the challenges of settling in a vast, untamed wilderness or on the potential for economic gain through agriculture and trade. Think about the classic American narrative of westward expansion. What if that narrative had been shaped by a different colonial power with different priorities and values?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if those iconic images of pioneers and covered wagons would even exist. Maybe they'd be replaced by, like, English merchants in fancy carriages trying to navigate muddy roads and avoid getting lost in the wilderness.
Exactly. The stories we tell about the past, the heroes we celebrate, the villains we condemn, are all shaped by who gets to hold the pen. And in this alternate timeline, that pen could have been held by someone entirely different.
It's incredible to think how much power those early explorers and colonizers had, not just in shaping the physical landscape of the Americas, but in shaping the very stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from.
It really is.
But we've been talking a lot about the big picture, the sweeping changes. I'm curious to explore how this alternate timeline might have impacted individual lives. Would people's everyday experiences have been drastically different?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll delve into in the next segment. After all, history isn't just about kings and queens, wars and revolutions. It's about the lives of ordinary people, the choices they made, and the legacies they left behind.
All right, so we've journeyed through a world without Columbus, explored the political power shifts, imagined different cultural landscapes, even tasted alternate culinary delights. But as fascinating as all that is, it's kind of like looking at a map of a foreign country. You get the lay of the land, but you don't really know what it's like to live there.
You're exactly right. It's one thing to talk about sweeping historical changes, but it's another to connect those changes to the everyday lives of people.
Right.
After all, history is made up of millions of individual stories, each one unique and irreplaceable.
So let's zoom in a bit.
Yeah.
If the discovery and colonization of the Americas had unfolded differently, what would that have meant for, regular folks? What would their lives have looked like?
Well, imagine for a moment that your ancestors had emigrated from, say, Portugal instead of Spain.
Okay.
Or maybe they arrived a century later. Or maybe they never left Europe at all. Your family tree, your cultural heritage, even your language could be completely different.
Whoa, that's trippy. It's like looking in a mirror and seeing a stranger staring back at you. But you're right, those seemingly small changes in the past could have had a ripple effect that continues to this day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about the jobs. People had the food, they ate the clothes, they wore the stories they told their children. All of those aspects of daily life could have been profoundly different depending on which European power held sway in the Americas.
Okay, so we've got different family histories, different cultural influences, maybe even different careers. But what about the bigger picture? Would people's values, their beliefs, their understanding of the world have been fundamentally different?
It's certainly possible. Remember, the age of exploration wasn't just about discovering new lands.
Right.
It was about expanding horizons, challenging assumptions, and redefining what it meant to be human.
Sure.
Imagine how those ideas would have evolved if the dominant cultural influences had been different.
Yeah, it's like those choose-your-own-adventure books, but on a global scale.
Yeah.
Every decision, every twist of fate leads to a different outcome. And it's not just about the past. It makes you wonder how our present day challenges our hopes and fears, our dreams for the future, might be different if we were living in this alternate reality.
That's the beauty of exploring alternate histories, isn't it? It's not just about looking back. It's about looking forward. It's about recognizing the incredible power of choices, both big and small, to shape the course of human events.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by a sense of, possibility. It's almost overwhelming to think about all the different paths history could have taken, all the worlds that might have been.
Right.
But it's also incredibly liberating.
I think you've hit on something really important. Studying alternate histories reminds us that nothing is inevitable.
Yeah.
The future is not predetermined. We have the power to make choices, to influence events, to shape the world we want to live in.
So what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is the realization that history is not just a collection of facts and dates. It's a living, breathing story that continues to unfold. And by exploring those what-ifs, by stepping outside of our familiar narratives, We gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and fragility of the world we inhabit.
It's like we've been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a chance to see the machinery of history at work. And even though we can't change the past, we can certainly learn from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, by contemplating these alternate paths, we can gain a fresh perspective on the challenges and opportunities of our own time. After all, the past may be prologue, but it's not destiny. We have the power to write our own stories on the grand stage of history.
So as we close this chapter of the deep dive, we leave you with this thought. If history had taken a different turn, what kind of world would you have built? What stories would you have told? What legacies would you have left behind? It's a question worth asking ourselves, not just as students of history, but as active participants in the ongoing saga of human existence.
And remember, this is just one of countless alternate timelines we could explore. So keep those what-if questions coming, because the more we question, the more we learn, and the more we understand the incredible tapestry of human history.
Thanks for joining us on this mind-bending journey through a world without Columbus. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.